у нас вот как раз-таки вебинар записывается, что данная запись будет размещена на нашем мини-сайте, для того, чтобы все остальные коллеги, которые не смогли сегодня присутствовать, у них была возможность посмотреть вебинар и ознакомиться с содержанием. Соответственно, если вы не хотите, чтобы видео ваше попадало на запись, пожалуйста, выключите камеру. Это совершенно нормально. Также я попрошу всех выключить микрофоны на время основной содержательной части, чтобы все спокойно смогли прослушать вебинар. И последний момент технический. У нас сегодня вебинар будет проходить на английском языке с синхронным переводом на русский. Поэтому, пожалуйста, когда у нас начнет спикер выступать, в нижней панели вашего экрана найдите значок глобуса, да, перевод, и выберите канал перевода с английского на русский. Теперь хотелось бы вкратце рассказать про контекст, да, в рамках которого мы осуществляем свою деятельность и разработали данную программу обучения. Мы являемся представителями команды Дарья Scaffold. Дарья Scaffold – это часть инициативы Европейского Союза. Дарья на русском она расшифровывается как «Диалог и действия для находчивой молодежи Центральной Азии». И данную инициативу реализует Европейский фонд образования в тесном сотрудничестве с 5 национальными органами, которые отвечают за развитие образования и развитие профессиональных навыков в каждой из 5 республик Центральной Азии. В свою очередь, инициатива Дарья поддерживает стратегию Европейского Союза Global Gateway, и в рамках Дарья Scaffold мы стремимся создать долгосрочные улучшения в качестве профессионального развития, профессионального образования и обучения в странах Центральной Азии. И наша задача, в частности, это помочь педагогам использовать компетентностный подход в ежедневной практике и еще лучше планировать свои занятия. И как раз-таки одним из инструментов, основным инструментом является Scaffold. И мы очень рады, что благодаря Scaffold все больше и больше педагогов в регионе ознакомливаются с его работой и применяют его. Также хотелось бы отметить что мы помимо образовательных ресурсов также стремимся создать культуру живого общения и обмена опытом между коллегами. Поэтому у нас для этого существует 2 пространства. То есть первое пространство – это Telegram-сообщество, где сейчас уже порядка 1100 участников со всех 5 стран Центральной Азии, где можно задавать вопросы, делиться впечатлениями, рассказывать о своих практиках, может быть, делиться какими-то проблемами для того, чтобы все коллеги со всего региона могли также вам помочь и дать совет. Мы очень будем рады, если вы присоединитесь к этому сообществу, если вы еще не там. И второе пространство у нас – это мини-сайт Дарья Scaffold, то есть это такая большая страница, где расположены все полезные ресурсы, полезные дополнительные инструменты, которые усиливают опыт имплементации Scaffold. То есть там могут быть и документы, также шаблоны, также планы занятий коллег со всей Центральной Азии для того, чтобы вы могли на практике посмотреть, в каком контексте и как Scaffold имплементируется во всех 5 странах. Ссылки на оба ресурса у нас сейчас в чате, поэтому можете сохранить их прямо сейчас. Я повторюсь, мы с вами переходим к второму вебинару из серии международных вебинаров Дарья Scaffold. Можно будет, пожалуйста, следующий слайд. В данной серии у нас с вами 7 вебинаров. Первый из них уже прошел. На этот год у нас второй вебинар завершающий. Уже с третьего начиная вебинара они у нас будут проходить с января месяца. Все анонсы данных вебинаров будут у нас размещены в нашем Telegram-сообществе. Поэтому, пожалуйста, оставайтесь в курсе и регистрируйтесь на данное мероприятие. Формат у всех вебинаров одинаковый, то есть каждая сессия у нас будет проходить на протяжении 90 минут. Основной язык у нас английский, русский, с синхронным переводом и на русский, на английский. Теперь позвольте перейти к повестке сегодняшней нашей сессии. Да, сегодняшняя сессия у нас пройдет под тематикой включения реальных жизненных контекстов в учебный процесс, осмысленное обучение, создающее реальный эффект. И на этом я бы хотела передать слово нашему эксперту Хейзел Исраил, который проведет для вас сегодняшний вебинар. Hazel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I'm very happy to be here today. Welcome, everybody. If you would like, please type in the chat to say hello and to tell us where you are coming from today. We would be very interested to know which country you are coming from today. That would be great. Thank you. So today, then, we are exploring one of the most powerful scaffold pedagogical principles, and that is bringing real life contexts into learning so that the learning has purpose and creates real impact. I came to this principle, I learned how to use this principle through necessity. I really needed to use this principle because when I was teaching, I used to work with some groups of students who had low skills levels and were really not very happy about their education. And they could not see the purpose of the learning when they were not confident that they would pass the exam or be successful in more traditional academic routes. So I had to find a way to engage these students. They felt like they could not care about their learning because they did not feel confident that they would be successful or that there was any purpose to the learning when they did not believe that they would pass the examination at the end of the year. So very often students would say to me, why are we doing this, miss? Why do we have to do this activity? What does this activity have to do with my life? How will learning this skill make my life more successful or better? So this is how I came to the idea that learning had to be purposeful and meaningful. So I did not want my students to say to me, why do we have to learn this? Why are we doing this? Because I had to design activities in a way that that they cared, that they about the learning, that they were interested in the learning, and the learning was purposeful and meaningful to them. We could have the next slide, please. So in Scaffold, real life learning is not about doing activities that look interesting. It is about designing learning that is meaningful, that matters to learners, that learners care about, and that results, this caring about the learning results in action that improves something in the real world. So has that impact beyond the classroom. When I did my master's degree, I did some research with my students because I used to teach skills elements of vocational courses. So catering, business, hair and beauty, tourism, engineering, motor vehicle maintenance, all sorts of vocational courses. And I had to do the literacy communication elements of those programs. And so the students were not particularly engaged because they believed that they had finished with English and maths. That was something they studied in school, and all they were really interested in was their career paths. And when I did this research, it was really interesting to notice that most of the work that they did in class was aimed towards success in formal assessments. So really, the learning activities had no value outside of college, filling in workbooks, answering questions that were sort of more knowledge-based. The learning didn't feel to the students that it would make them a better plumber, a better chef, a better hairdresser, you know? So I had to design the communication learning in a way that the students could see how it linked directly to their life when they leave college, so that the learning had value beyond their full-time education. So for this reason then, so we're going to look at this principle, and today's focus is going to look at why purpose and meaning matter, why purpose and meaning are important to learning, how real world contexts can drive real world impacts, can really make a difference in the world. We're going to look at some practical strategies from Scaffold, and hopefully we can work with you to design your own purposeful ideas. So if we could have the next slide, please. So first of all then, what I'd like you to spend a few minutes thinking about, think about your learners and in your context where you teach, what makes learning feel meaningful to learners? So if you take a minute, would you type in the chat, please, what you think makes learning feel meaningful to learners? Now, it's quite tricky for me to see. There we go. So, in my experience, what makes learning feel meaningful, or certainly what made learning feel meaningful to my learners, was when learners could see how the tasks and the in-class activities connect to real life. Like I said, had value beyond the full-time course, not just about assessment, not just about examinations. Also, learning felt meaningful to learners when they create something that someone else will actually use. They're being of service to another person, like the service learning teaching method in the scaffold cards. So they're making something for somebody else. Also, learning can feel meaningful to learners when they work on problems they experience personally, like safety or well-being or the environment. So problems that have a direct impact on students' lives when they have that personal experience and they can work together to solve those problems. Also, learning can feel more meaningful to learners when the learning helps them prepare for future work, when they can recognize that the task will be something that they will have to do in their jobs. So it's future work or responsibilities. Equally, learning can feel more meaningful to learners when they believe their ideas can make a difference in their community, in their family lives, or in their schools.
And
So,
we also got one answer. So basically, a personal example, teacher's competence, and relevant education, relevant learning makes the process more meaningful.
yes, definitely. That relevance is key. That's a really good point. Yes. And about having that faith in the teachers. Yes, thank you for those contributions. Great. Could we have the next slide, please? Great. Yes. So that variety. So it's not just learning in the same way. Excellent. Great answers. Thank you. So when we think about this scaffold principle, then in the scaffold full guide, which is available on our main website, it says that real life learning requires learning through experience, so that experiential learning, that there are authentic purposes that matter to learners, that have that real impact, that there is that interaction with reality, so that sort of working with the real world, whether it's bringing people into the classroom or whether it's taking students out to businesses, to local areas. So it's that interaction with the real world. Also, that the learning is geared towards action, that the learners are actually going to do something concrete, do something real in the real world as well, and that there is reflection where students think back to evaluate what they've done, what they've experienced, and that they can make changes to their activity, to their planning, to their learning in response to that reflection. If we could have the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So when learning has a clear purpose, learners see the reason to care. Learners can recognize the importance of the learning. Purpose turns activity into meaningful action and turns content into competence. So when learners have gained some knowledge, or they've gained some skills, or understanding even, where they can apply that learning to create real impact. So I've got on the slide here the purpose chain. So the purpose leads to meaning, which leads to engagement, which leads to application, which can lead to real impact. And in this way, learners will never have to ask you why they need to learn something, because it will be obvious to them. They will have experienced the importance of that knowledge or those skills. Real life contexts matter because they make learning purposeful. When learners are doing something for a real audience or solving a real issue, motivation increases dramatically to the point of excitement. When we introduce real world contexts for the first time, learners can become very motivated and very excited because traditionally learners are in classrooms working with pieces of paper, not solving problems to make the world a better place, you know. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What do our learners care about? So what real world issue, need, or topic do you think your learners care about right now? If you'd like to type some in the chat, please. When I think about my students, they used to care about reducing environmental impact in their local area, for example, or improving digital safety and managing online behavior, finding pathways to decent work or developing entrepreneurial skills. Other things learners care about could be things like supporting younger pupils or less able pupils, supporting and working with families or local community groups, maybe making public spaces safer, cleaner, or more welcoming, creating things for young people to do locally. You know, these are the sorts of things that my students cared about. What do you think your students care about? Same sorts of things, would you say? Is there anything else, anything different you think your students care about? Okay, then I'm next going to take you through a series of tips. If I could have the next slide, please. So I will walk you through 6 practical ways to build purpose and impact in your practice. So how do we do this? How do we bring these real world contexts into the classroom, into our learning design to create that real world impact? So for each scaffold planning tip, then we will explore how it strengthens purpose and leads to this real impact. So tip 1 then is to start with what matters. Purpose begins by anchoring learning in what learners value. So real life learning becomes meaningful when it begins with what learners genuinely care about. Purpose emerges from connecting learning activities to learners' interests, to their identities, to their needs, or those real problems in their environment and community. For example, learners are concerned about unsafe pedestrian areas near the school or campus. A learning activity is designed around analysing traffic patterns and proposing improvements to local authorities. So that's like starting with something that the learners really care about. That's tip number 1. If we could move the slide, please, to tip number 2. Yes, so disconnection with reality. Yeah. So spending too much time on screens. Lots of young people report feeling isolated, and social media does not help this, I don't think. So maybe it's that real world opportunities to connect with their peers, with other young people. So tip 2 then is to create a climate for experimentation. So purposeful learning requires that space to explore, space to experiment. Learners need an environment where they can try ideas, test ideas, take small risks, and investigate real-world conditions without fear of getting things wrong. So an example would be before designing a final product, learners test several different approaches in small groups, maybe a simple prototype, a quick interview, a rough sketch or script. And the focus is on exploring possibilities. This is the essence of creativity, coming up with very many different ways to do something. So we're not looking for perfection. We're letting them try things out to test different approaches. So what do you think helps your learners feel safe enough to experiment with real ideas? If you'd like to type into the chat, what helps your learners feel safe to experiment, to take those risks, to test their ideas? So some of the things that I've used in the past to help learners to feel safe enough to experiment is that they know that their early attempts are not graded. There's no test, there's no assessment. It's simply a part of the process of learning. So they're not going to be judged for those experimentations because that will inhibit creativity and will inhibit that risk taking that we want students to do. So also having permission to try small steps rather than big risky tasks, to try little things along the way to see how things work, that sort of iteration. Also, working in supportive pairs or small groups can help students feel more confident to experiment and to explore. And this finally, another sort of really important one is to see the teacher model mistakes and how to learn from them. Teachers very often are very reluctant to show their students when they don't know something, when they're not sure. You know, there's this tradition of teachers knowing everything, when actually students can learn so much from watching a teacher manage mistakes. A sort of a classic example of this would be when a student or a pupil asks a teacher something they do not know. The teacher can say, well, actually, I do not know the answer to that question at this time, but let us find out. This is what we can do to find out. So it's modeling those sorts of drawbacks where we don't know. And equally, similarly with mistakes, that mistakes are not final, they're not terminal. We can learn so much from them. And this is important for teachers to model, but also that we reassure students clearly that it's normal if an idea does not work the first time. It's not the end of the world, you know? Okay, so if we could move on to the next slide, which is tip 3, where we want to allow failure, reflection, and recovery. And this is a big idea in entrepreneurial learning. One of the competence frameworks in Scaffold is Entrecom, and it's very much about creativity, innovation, creating different types of value for somebody else. So you're really making something from the beginning, you know, whether it's an experience or a resource. And so we encourage failure because we believe that very powerful learning can come from failure, and that we want to show students or teach students how to recover very quickly from failure. It's not the end of the world. A very famous man who invented light bulbs, electric light bulbs, he said that he never failed. He just came up with 10,000 ideas which did not work. And that's a very famous story used to demonstrate that development, creativity, coming up with new ideas, all requires an element of experimentation, which will involve some failures sometimes. And that's all part of the learning process. So also when we look to apply learning to create real world impact, that impact grows when learners can test ideas and learn from what doesn't work and try again. So failure is essential to real learning. When learners are working with real purposes, not everything will work out, not everything will succeed. And this is where the reflection becomes so important, because it is the process of a reflection which really anchors the learning. So that structured reflection helps learners to analyze what happened, to adjust, and to try again, building resilience and competence and not undermining motivation. We don't want learners who will give up at the first challenge. You know, we want learners who will find another way and be resilient and determined, and learners who will persevere. So an example of this would be learners creating an early version of a digital campaign for the community. And unfortunately, the campaign receives limited engagement. So they review and reflect, they change and revise their messaging and test again with significantly improved outcomes. So what sort of, well, I'll give you some examples of some failures, reflections and recoveries. So for example, if a student designs a poster that users initially find unclear, then they can gain feedback from early users and revise and improve that poster with clearer messaging. Another example might be testing a simple prototype that doesn't function particularly well at first. So it's finding out what does work, what could be improved, making those improvements through a process of iteration. Equally, conducting an interview or a survey that yields limited information can bring the teacher or researcher to improve the questions. So this is why when we conduct surveys or interviews, we do a pilot to test the questions, to make sure that the questions will give us the information we are looking for. So again, it's this iteration, it's trying things out, reflecting, improving in an ongoing way. Another example could be creating a video or a script that needs to be restructured following peer feedback, or trying a teamwork approach that doesn't go smoothly and so that means that the roles within the team or ways of working within the teams need to be refined and adapted, changing roles even perhaps. But it's that willingness to change direction, to reflect, to review, and to improve in a continuing way. So if we could please move on to the next slide. So this is tip 4, which is all about using real world audiences and real world settings. So learning gains meaning when it is directed towards someone beyond the teacher. A real audience, an authentic audience, gives purpose, raises quality, and creates the possibility of real impact. So that purpose deepens when learners create something for people who genuinely need it. So the example I've included here on the slide is instead of writing an essay, learners prepare a short video or infographic explaining a scientific concept for parents or local organizations or younger learners. So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes to think about who could use or benefit from your learners' work. Who could be an authentic audience for your learners? I'll give you a couple of minutes there to type in the chat. Who could use or benefit from your learners' work?
So we've got the first answer. It's basically teachers and parents.
Teachers, parents, yes. Anybody else outside of the college who might benefit from the application of your learners' knowledge and skills? In Wales, we have a really good programme to promote education. Wales is in the United Kingdom and it's where I live. And it's called Engineering Education in Schools. And this organisation has basically works with schools. So each school will have a team of learners, about 6 to 8 learners, and those learners go out into local businesses, which are not just small local businesses. They can be big, international companies as well. And they are given a problem that the business experiences, and it becomes the job of those students to solve the problem in the real business, in the real world. And it's excellent experience. The students gain so many wide-ranging skills and competence through this experience. And very often the businesses actually implement the solutions that the students design. So the businesses are receiving sort of fresh minds, fresh eyes to come up with new ideas. Young people can be much more creative than older people because they have different experiences. But that's an excellent initiative, solving problems for businesses in the community. Equally, community groups. There are examples where students have, say, students on a sports course would go and provide coaching, football coaching, in primary schools because there's a shortage of men willing to coach football teams. So the students will go and do it. So it's an excellent way of students applying their skills in the real world to create real world impact. But equally, they're solving a problem, so they get to practice their skills, apply their learning, but they're making life better for primary pupils who would not be able to play football otherwise, for example. So
And we've got another answer. So who else, benefits? It's the peers, the classmates,
yes,
and in some cases, it's the employers
yes,
as well.
yes, great, definitely. So some examples that I prepared were that local businesses or organizations need simple solutions or insights. Younger students could benefit from explanations or demonstrations. And this is a really nice example when our students have learned something, to ask them to go and teach it to another person is a very powerful method for building confidence, but also making the learning more memorable. Um, there are various proverbs. I can't remember it exactly, but basically, what the proverb says is if I read something, I only remember 5%. If you tell me, I will remember 10%. If I've got to teach it, I know it. You've got to really know something well to be able to teach it. Equally, community groups can benefit. Community groups that need accessible information, maybe about health or environment or safety. But I've also known of groups of students who are learning computer skills and digital skills who go out into the community to support older people to be able to use digital devices more confidently, how to use mobile phones, how to use computers. So much of our lives today are online, and there is little provision for older people in terms of how to learn to use these digital devices. So it's excellent for the students to go out and become the teachers and to coach and mentor older people to become more confident users of digital technology. Equally, students can apply their learning, their skills, and their knowledge to support school or campus management teams, seeking practical suggestions for improvement. I'm doing a project with local schools, working with students with additional learning needs, who will be interviewing each other to identify their needs and preferences in terms of their additional learning needs, to design their ideal learning space. So what do they need in a learning space for it to be a really comfortable and stimulating environment to support their learning? So these groups of learners will then build their designs and their ideas in a program called Minecraft, which is sort of a three-dimensional online digital platform. And then once the schools will come together and the learners will share their ideas with each other. So in this way, teachers are learning about what their pupils and students need and how they like to learn and what they feel they need in their environment to support and promote better learning. But more importantly, in terms of that real world impact, those pupils will then go on to pitch their ideas to policymakers at government national level, but also at local regional level. Because I'm almost certain that many of the ideas that the students will come up with will be very easy to bring to life and may well be very cheap, will cost very little money. But equally, once the schools have these lists of what their students feel they need, it becomes a way for local businesses to sponsor or provide those resources or facilities, whatever it is that the pupils need. But I think those recommendations to policymakers are a really great real world impact, but it also then begins a sort of action plan for what the schools need to do to be able to make the environment the best it can be for learners with wide-ranging different additional learning needs. Similarly, families or local residents could use guides or tutorials or awareness raising resources. So there are very many different types of audience who can benefit directly from the application of pupils' learning. And it boosts that motivation for learners and boosts that engagement. So then tip 5, using the iterative cycles. So if we plan for multiple iterations, so that's that completing a task, reviewing it, what can be improved, making an improved version, reviewing it, making those improvements. So you've got an improved project and it goes on. That iterative cycle continues. So real impact comes from refining work through multiple versions. And iteration mirrors professional practice, allowing learners to build skills, judgment, and confidence by improving work step by step. And this links nicely to that growth mindset, with continued attention, with continued effort and activity, things develop, things improve, things progress. So no real world product works perfectly the first time. Iteration is essential. So the question was, what learner output or what product or output in your context could improve through 2 or 3 iterations then, 2 or 3 changes. So some examples that I came up with were a digital poster, for example, or infographic explaining a community issue. Maybe creating a prototype, a device or a model or a system created in a vocational workshop. Students and pupils could create a podcast episode or a short educational video, because that value of peer-to-peer communication, very often pupils and students in the UK will create videos for other pupils and students about bullying or about the dangers of alcohol or smoking or vaping. And that messaging is much, much more impactful. It's much more powerful when it's peer-to-peer rather than being told by a figure of authority, Equally, learners could write a guide for younger learners or community members in terms of how to use different tools or access different services, or maybe even a business pitch, a training demonstration, or a problem-solving proposal. So this is particularly useful in when we think about vocational learning, which is very often includes technical competence, plastering a wall, for example, or making a table. Well, if pupils could make a video, they can put that on YouTube. YouTube is an excellent example of these sort of how-to guide videos. In fact, I think you are very unlikely to need to find how to do something when there is not a tutorial video on YouTube. They've got everything. I remember talking to my father, and I was telling my father how, if you want to know how to do something, there is a video on YouTube for it. And I challenged my father to think of a topic that there would not be a tutorial for on YouTube. So my father was thinking and he said, okay, he said, how about how to remove your appendix, how to remove your own appendix. So we did the search and there were 3 videos on YouTube about how to remove your own appendix. So it really is true that there are tutorials for everything. But then as new products and services appear, there is this requirement for tutorials. And why not ask our students and pupils to create those tutorials? Because it also reflects that idea I mentioned earlier about if you really want to know something or understand it, try and teach it to somebody else. So
And
that's
we've got, yes, answer to the question. It's logical thinking and
yes.
creativity.
Yes, definitely. That's great. Thank you. Please do interact. Please comment in the chat. I know it would make for a much richer session to have your participation and your contributions also. Thank you. Okay, so then if we go on to tip 6, which is testing assumptions with real users. So impact, that real world impact that we are talking about, requires checking what actually works, not what we assume will work. Oh, yes, I think that will work. No. We must test it. So authenticity means checking whether ideas actually work in the real world. Quick user tests help learners to gather evidence, challenge assumptions, and refine their solutions to create genuine value. So the example I've included on the slide here is before finalizing an information poster, learners ask real users, so that could be workshop staff, community members, other employees. They ask for feedback on the clarity and the usefulness and the tone of a poster particularly, and the insights gained from that feedback can lead to a more effective and more successful final product. Okay, so I've got some examples of some quick real-world tests that learners could run to check if their ideas work. So things like, it doesn't have to be an enormous piloting exercise. It can be very short, simple actions to test their ideas and assumptions with real users. For example, asking 3 real users for quick feedback on a draft product. Maybe observing small groups using their prototypes for 2 minutes. Testing a communication product, a poster or a video by showing it to classmates, showing it to parents, asking them what for feedback. Another example could be running a short trial of a service idea within the school or workshop, testing it out, seeing how it goes, but always looking for feedback to inform reflection, to feed into iterations, to make improvements. Posting a draft digital product privately and checking whether the intended message is understood. Okay, we could move on to the next slide, please, which is the lovely, yes, gathering information, checking and testing, finally presenting, gathering feedback. Great, that's lovely. And what's the message from Batir, please, Victoria?
That was the answer to the previous question. I overheard it.
Okay, that's great. Lovely, thank you. So in this slide then, I'm going to walk through an example to demonstrate a purposeful learning design. So imagine a group of learners concerned about waste on their campus, in their school. So their purpose then is to reduce waste and create cleaner, safer spaces. So the key steps then in this process would be to define the purpose, collect real data, analyze patterns, prototype solutions, present to campus management, and implement top recommendations. So if you look, that first prompt then is what matters to the students. So those learners identified something they genuinely cared about. They genuinely cared about the amount of waste on campus, and they noticed this problem growing and getting worse. So the second prompt is that purpose, where they had a very clear purpose, which was to reduce waste and improve shared spaces. The third prompt then is that real world action, where they gathered real data, photographs, tallies to count the volume of waste, and observations. So the fourth prompt is experimentation and failure. So some of their early ideas didn't work. And like we said previously, it's often the case that early ideas won't work straight away. They'll need some refinement, and these ideas were refined in this example through reflection. The fifth prompt then is to have that authentic audience. So they presented to campus leadership and the facilities team, people who could act, people who could make a difference. They were really speaking to the right people then in the organization to try to implement their ideas. Prompt 6 then is that real impact. 2 of their recommendations were implemented, and learners saw their work change the environment and improve the situation to help to solve the problem. So notice how purpose drives every stage of that learning. It's all to achieve those concrete real world impacts. So if I move on to the next slide then. So now this is your turn. Now this is the opportunity for us to work together, for you to build your own purposeful learning idea. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and then I would like you to jot your ideas in the chat as we work through. And then this will help you to create a purposeful learning design once we've answered all these questions. Please share as many ideas as possible, because we can use them to inspire each other, or may well be ideas that are useful to our colleagues in the webinar here today. Okay, so the first question, and we'll take about 3 minutes for each. I'll give 3 minutes for you to think, but also for you to type in the chat, okay? So the first question then is, What meaningful purpose could drive your next learning activity? What meaningful purpose could you use to drive your next learning activity and to engage and motivate your students? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to think of a purpose that will motivate and engage your students.
Добрый день. Можно задать вопрос?
Yes, please do.
Добрый день, я вас всех рада видеть. Вот как раз-таки того, что мы сегодня с вами прошли, я провела занятие, и как раз-таки мы в первую очередь разбирали цель, результат и насколько она была, урок настолько был достигнуть своей цели и его развитие компетенций, и в целом обратную связь. Все занятие было построено на методике Scaffold по карточкам. Я девочкам скидывала его построение к плану урока, также и план анализа, своего анализа по компетенциям, именно плана, цели в области, какие, то есть цели я поставила, какие планы поставила и какие результаты получила. После работы я некий такой анализ, мониторинг сделала. Но дальше, наверное, коллеги, если есть такая необходимость, я могу его скинуть в Телеграм наш канал, чтобы не то чтобы оценили, а как поделиться. В целом, то, что вы сегодня, Хейзел, сказали, практически многие вот эти подпункты были учтены. И здесь у меня было основы бизнеса и предпринимательства занятия, а по специальности занятие проходила графическим дизайнером. И она ключевую роль здесь сыграла, то, что вот его практическое применение, а тема занятия была маркетинг, основа ведения маркетинга, СММ и реклама. Она как раз-таки очень хорошо помогла в решении и разработке, и они сделали в течение 90 минут занятий, сделали план-проект, где они самостоятельно вручную это все сделали и защитили свою работу. И за 90 минут их проект был настолько актуален и реальным, потому что в реальном режиме они это все использовали, сделали. И каждая команда выступила самостоятельно, и в каждой команде участник тоже также отдельно выступил. То есть все участники группы участвовали, и это было классно. Оценивали они, сверстники, сами себя. То есть моя задача была просто им дать хороший менеджмент. В целом все, и вот как раз-таки вот сегодняшнее то, что мы с вами прошли, она была очень удобна, плодотворна, и скаффолд здесь уже более хорошие плоды дает, могу сказать, потому что первый год, когда мы только его изучили, мы ознакомливались, сейчас мы уже его применяем, и, естественно, я готова делиться своим опытом. К сожалению, просто времени нету, не хватает практически писать в телеграм-канале, к сожалению просто. А так в документах мы уже здесь отчеты полностью пишем, и поурочные планы, и в программе оно называется. Спасибо большое, коллеги.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that example. And this is an excellent example of how I can talk to you all day long, but it's so much more meaningful when we hear it from peers. Thank you so much for sharing that example. That was really, really interesting. And that's great. Thank you very much. So yes, that's a really good example of a meaningful purpose. Has anybody else thought of any purposes that would motivate their students, things that your students would be really excited to do? Topics or activities that your students really like? So we mentioned some earlier, didn't we? Things like health, well-being, getting a job in the future, the environment, family, communities, sports.
Можно еще будет добавить, да, в плане темы экологии, чуть-чуть небольшую, да, добавочку сделаю. Мы обучаем парикмахеров. И когда мы обучаем парикмахеров, хочешь не хочешь, социальные, и все компетенции есть. Но в плане защиты экологии, когда у нас идет вот зеленая компетенция, мы с некоторыми материалами работаем как фольга. Фольга – это при блондировании, при обесцвечивании пользуемся. К сожалению, перерабатывания именно фольги нету такого. И мусороперерабатывающих таких моментов. Поэтому фольгу мы стараемся несколько раз, чтобы они могли использовать. Не один раз использовали, выкинули, а так, чтобы его несколько раз использовали. И когда его мы в мусор выкидываем, мы его упаковывали отдельно. Хотя мы не знаем, когда, допустим, мусор забирают, насколько это вот они отдельно его перерабатывать, нет. Но, к сожалению, просто, чтобы каждый ученик понимал, что он не перерабатывается, он просто с земли, с мусора не исчезает даже после обработки. Поэтому, да, в индустрии красоты есть сложности в плане защиты экологии. То есть вот этот момент мы всегда указываем, что это большая проблема, что они должны учитывать моменты для будущего поколения, чтобы зеленая экология, она сохранялась. Спасибо.
That's great, lovely. Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent example, definitely. Yes. Any other examples that people would like to describe or share instead of typing in the chat? Okay. I'll move on to the next question then. So that was, what purpose could motivate your students and drive your learning activity? But the next question then is, whose life, work, or community could be better because of this learning? Who could we apply learning to benefit? Who could benefit? So in the example just shared, that was future generations could benefit from preserving and reusing the foils. Can you think of any other examples where people benefit from the application of learning? I'll give you some minutes to think about that. Think if there's some examples for you to share, some ideas.
Разрешите мне? Виктория, можно насчет этого сказать?
Да, пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте, коллеги. Здравствуйте, уважаемый Физер. Рад вас
Hi,
видеть.
Batir.
Рад вас видеть. И всех остальных тоже очень рад видеть. С удовольствием слушаю вашу лекцию. Ну вот сейчас вы сказали насчет целей и кто от них получит пользу. Я вот, исходя из своей практики, так как я работаю в Институте повышения квалификации педагогических кадров, я на занятиях обычно использую методы, как надо использовать, обучаю, как использовать карты скафов. Моя цель моя, которую я ставлю перед своими слушателями, это научиться этому инструменту и использовать его в дальнейшей своей практике, а также дать понять или объяснить, или же научить, если они могут, научить этому инструменту своих преподавателей. Кто от этого получает пользу? От этого пользу получают в первую очередь сами преподаватели, И также, которые преподаватели начинали применять методику скафов, инструмент скафов, они дают ощутимую пользу для своих учеников. Но вот у меня такого предмета нету, чтобы я вот как вот в колледже или там в школе вот там биологию, химию преподавал. У меня вот обобщенное, то, что я хочу сказать. Обобщенное, да. У меня я преподаю модули, но в основном я преподаю скафолд. Поэтому у меня и цель такая, и результаты мои такие. Все, что хотел сказать. Спасибо большое за внимание.
That's great, lovely. Thank you, Batir. That's a really good example. Yes, and so not only, I would say, not only do the teachers benefit and the trainee teachers, but as you say, the learners will benefit from improved pedagogy. But equally, in the case of vocational learners, employers will benefit further on in the future from the fact that learners have been practicing and developing their competence in these real world contexts. They will be much more confident in the workplace as a result of these methods. So the next question as a part of this your purposeful learning idea would be, what would be the first small real world action that your learners could take to begin to think about how to apply their learning, how to use their knowledge and skills to create something for somebody else or to make an improvement? What first small real world action could your learners take? I mean, for me, I think it would be about identifying problems, speaking to people who are directly experiencing those problems in their lives or users of particular tools. I'm thinking of some examples where, not my students, but students I've seen in the media. One student actually used a 3D printer to print a prosthetic arm for a little boy who lived next door. So he had a neighbour who was waiting for a very long time for a prosthetic arm. So the student made one for him using a 3D printer, which is a phenomenal example of that real world impact, you know. There are other examples of some students who I know locally who love to surf. They love surfing on the waves, and they wanted to make surfing accessible to people with disabilities. So they researched interest, you know, what sort of levels of interest are there among disabled people. So then they created adapted surfboards so that people with missing limbs or particular disabilities could still experience the joy of surfing, which is a really, really powerful example. I mean, that it doesn't always have to be world changing that way. Learners can apply their learning in smaller ways to make the world a better place for people. But then finally, how could learners get feedback and improve their work for greater impact? So in what ways could learners get feedback from those authentic audiences that we've been talking about today to improve their work, to boost even more impact from the application of their learning? So an obvious one in terms of getting feedback would be a survey, or
Можно
maybe,
будет еще добавить, коллеги?
yes, please do.
Я бы хотела сказать, что когда они свои полученные знания через навыки показывают, вот тогда они результат обучения видят и понимают. И мы вот в этом моменте, вот в этом контексте мы можем сказать, что мы получаем обратную связь, когда мы в реальной жизни, как они в реальном мире могут сделать, могут быть конкурентоспособными, быть своей специальности на рынке, что они востребованы, что они могут такие же идеальные работы делать по потребностям, то это наилучший результат. И каждый раз, когда мы расписываем каждый момент по структуре, допустим, scaffold, мы это видим, мы каждый момент учитываем. То есть вот эти шаги, которые по созданию плана урока и обратный конечный результат мы видим, конечно, это уже радует. Только через свои навыки, через себя пропустив, мы получаем обратную связь от наших учеников. Спасибо.
Yes, great. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes. So yes, surveys, we can use focus groups is another one, but all these are sort of processes which are useful also in the real world when people go into work. They may very well, if they're working with customers or providing a service, they may very well need to secure feedback. Every online purchase we make usually sends an email to say, how was your shopping experience? How was your product? Give us feedback, because it sort of boosts confidence for businesses. In the same way that feedback boosts confidence for businesses, feedback can boost confidence for our students, for our pupils, and it will help them to improve their work for greater impact. But working with real audiences, with real end users, really improves that authenticity. That's what we mean by authentic, that it's purposeful, it's real, it's tangible, it's concrete. It's worth learning, it's worth being able to do that because I can do something real with it, And certainly when I think about my students, that was the only way I could get them to learn, because they really had negative experiences in school. They had limited experience of success. So when I could take my students out of the classroom into the real world, they could see the tangible benefits and results of their efforts, of their activity. And it gave them confidence and motivated them to want to be better, to learn more, to be able to do more things. So it was really impactful. So I've also created for you, if we could move to the next slide, a simple checklist that you can use with any class in any module or training session. And I've got 8 steps there. So there's step 1, start with what matters to learners, identify issues, interests, or needs that are meaningful in the students' and pupils' real lives. Step 2, define a clear, meaningful purpose. Clarify what the learning is for, the improvement, the contribution, or the change that learners will aim to create. Step 3 is to identify that potential real-world impact, specifying how the work will benefit people, communities, workplaces, or the environment. Step 4 is to choose an authentic audience. Begin with a concrete, low-risk step that starts the learning by doing process. No, sorry, back to step 4, choose an authentic audience, decide who will genuinely use, value, or respond to learners' outputs. Step 5 is to plan the first small real-world action. I apologize. Begin with a concrete, low-risk step that starts that process of learning through experience, learning by doing. Step 6 is to build in feedback and iteration, design cycles of testing, revising, refining and improving in an ongoing sense. So there's that ongoing improvements identified through reflection. Step 7 is to test ideas with real users. And this step can ensure that learners gather real evidence about what works and what needs improvement. And then finally, step 8 is to capture and reflect on the impact. Use artifacts, observations, feedback and stories to understand the difference that the learning made. How has the application of this learning changed life for communities, other pupils, whoever the end user is? In what ways is life different and better now as a result of that? So I'd be interested in which step in this checklist do you think will most strengthen purpose and impact for your learners? If you could just type a number in the chat. If you had to pick one of those steps, if you had to pick one step, which step would most increase and strengthen purpose and impact for your learners, do you think? You could just type a number in the chat to pick one step. Number 5, lovely, yeah, good. Sort of how to get started, yes. Plan the first small real world action, great. Does anybody else have any other ideas in terms of which step in that checklist would make most difference to your students? I really like step 3, which is to identify the potential real-world impact, specifying how the work could benefit people, communities, workplaces, or the environment. It's that sort of notion of success. This is what we can achieve if we apply our learning in this way. Anybody got any different? So we've got a 5 and a 3. Anybody got any other steps they think would be more important to their learners? Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our next slide then, where I've prepared some context-specific examples for you, so we can see how this works across different phases of education. So I've got one here in schools, which could be primary or secondary, where the purpose is to improve the school's outdoor spaces to support well-being. So in terms of the real-world action, learners observe how pupils and students use the playground. They can interview pupils. They can create proposals for redesign and improvement. The audience for this work would be the school leadership or the parent council or parent-teacher associations. I'm not sure if you have something similar in your countries where it's a mechanism for engaging parents in the life of the school, whether it's through fundraising or volunteering. We have most schools have a sort of a parent council. Then the impact of that particular example is to have selected ideas which are implemented, and this leads ultimately then to improved play experiences. So I've got an example from a technical vocational education. So the purpose is to increase energy efficiency in the workshop or training facility. The real world action is that learners conduct an energy audit. They test equipment usage and can use that data analysis to propose improvements. And the audience for those recommendations would be workshop managers and industry partners. And the impact of that can be implementation of cost-saving measures. But there's so much excellent learning through those processes. When we talk about literacy and numeracy, teamwork, working with others, these are all inherent parts of the process of this learning. So it's not just learning about the subject. There are wide-ranging skills and competencies which are developed through these very rich real-world activities. So I've got an example here from adult learning, where the purpose is to help local job seekers to create better CVs or digital profiles, like on LinkedIn, for example. And the real world action is that adult learners work in teams to analyze needs. Then they create guides, run community drop-ins. The audience for this activity would be the local job centre, community centres, adults looking for work. And the impact potentially of this particular learning is that we would have adults with improved employability and improved confidence. The final example I've got for you then is one from the Central Asian context, where the purpose is to reduce the use of water in agricultural training or school gardens. So we want to really preserve water and use it more carefully. The real world action then is students can survey water use, they can test irrigation methods and build simple sensors even to see where most of the water is getting used. The audience then can be local farmers or school administration, depending on the focus of the activity, but the impact could be more efficient water use and greater shared knowledge amongst the local community. So those are some examples I've got there to share with you, to show how this principle can add value across the phases. So then the final slide then, all it is for me to say, we change it onto the final slide. I've got 3 minutes to say thank you very much. Thank you, participants. If we can share the downloadable checklist document. I've prepared a document for you which you are able to download and save, which is that simple checklist, so that when you come to plan using real world contexts in your learning, you've got those simple steps to follow which will help you to use these methods more easily and more effectively. But thank you so much for today. That you can see in the chat, there's the downloadable resource for you there. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your time and your participation. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us today as well. It's lovely to see everybody. I look forward to seeing you again in future events. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Хейзел, за сегодняшний вебинар. Спасибо большое активным участникам сегодняшнего вебинара. Хотели бы еще раз напомнить, да, то, что у нас сегодняшний вебинар был вторым из серии международных вебинаров Дарья Скаффолд. В рамках данной серии вебинаров мы в этом году уже с вами не встречаемся. Мы продолжим уже международные вебинары в январе следующего года. Пожалуйста, следите за анонсами. Так же, как и все наши вебинары, запись, а также материалы, то есть презентация и раздаточный шаблон, который только что мы отправили в чат, они будут доступны для скачивания сразу после сессии. в нашем телеграм-канале и на мини-странице Дарья Скапа. Поэтому еще раз продублируем ссылки для тех из вас, кто, может быть, еще не воспользовался этими ресурсами. Вот. И спасибо большое за предоставленное время. Надеемся, что у вас будет хороший вечер. И опять-таки в рамках данной сессии, данных вебинаров мы встречаемся в следующем году, поэтому желаем вам прекрасных праздников и прекрасных выходных дней. Встретимся с новыми силами, с новыми идеями уже в следующем году. А в рамках других вебинаров мы будем очень рады видеть вас на национальных вебинарах, которые у нас продлятся еще на следующей неделе. Спасибо всем большое. Доброго всем вечера.
Спасибо, счастливого Нового года. До свидания.